Okay, so I had mentioned that I wanted us to talk a little bit more about sort of all the things that are happening. And for me, specifically, the most salient thing, the thing that I can best convey, is what is happening to science and the intent of what they are doing around science in this administration. And it's important that there's pushback, and it's extremely important that someone in science or people in science are willing to talk about this. Because I know that for a very long time, the thought amongst people in science was that our work would speak for itself, and that there was sort of this generally agreed upon idea that science had inherent value that was seen by both sides of the aisle. And that is no longer the case. So, why don't we dig into what has happened since inauguration and talk a little bit more about everything, and I will provide some insight and context into things that are generally getting overlooked by people in the public who don't interact with science and don't understand. So, bear with me. This is going to be my first time sort of putting up graphics, and we'll sort of work on making them better over time, but I feel like it's important. It's also important to note that everything I'm going to tell you in this video is sourced, and all of the sources will be linked in the description. Feel free to browse through those. So, first thing we're going to look at is a sort of quick timeline of this administration's attack on science, and it's pretty coordinated. We're going to talk about each bit, but generally, it started right out of the gate. On the second day of the administration, there was a communications freeze from HHS and all of its sub-bodies. After that, less than a week later, we had the federal funding freeze, which, while that was broadly targeted at sort of all federal spending, it had a profound effect on science. And so we'll talk about it in that context. We'll talk about sort of the legal battles pertaining to that freeze. And then we're going to also talk about sort of the personnel battles that we're seeing. Another thing to note is that, as with previous sort of right-wing attacks on things, there are some direct, targeted things being done against scientists. That's important to point out. There are going to be some nitty-gritty details about the way they capped funding for grants, and then the way they talk about science. So they're attacking three really important pillars of science. They're attacking the financial, through grant funding, through the federal funding freeze. They're attacking personnel and workforce. This is done both through the hiring freezes that were put in place that are blanket, but then also through purges and reductions in force that we'll talk about, which are more recent and so are not on this graphic necessarily. And then communication, a thing that they have worked pretty tirelessly to sort of strip away. Taking all of these pillars so that science is not funded, so that people who do science feel afraid or lose their positions or their jobs, and communication so that it's very hard to tell what's going on. We will start with a communication freeze. So that freeze was put in place on the second day of the administration. Now, it had multiple provisions in this memo. One of them was something that I would consider not necessarily standard, but understandable in sort of the context of changing administrations. As the first thing was that nothing could be sent to the Office of the Federal Register until it had been approved by new appointees in departments for health and human services. The Office of the Federal Register is where rules go to get published. And so these are sort of regulatory things. And so you can understand how, if a previous administration did not align with you, you might not want their rules to be published and be put into force. So that one's understandable. However, the rest of it was not, and was a huge departure from things we've seen before. No department could issue any document publicly that was regulatory guidance, notice, grant announcements, communications generally through social media, websites, press releases, or listservs for things like newsletters. Those were nixed. And that's not normal. A lot of industries interact with the federal government, and specifically Health and Human Services, and parts of that, like the FDA and the USDA and the CDC. And there are reports that the public gets, sort of keeping the public up to date on what's happening. Those communications are important because they allow not just individuals, but groups to see what's happening and to respond. That communication is vital, and it shouldn't be cut off for partisan reasons, because what it communicates is generally nonpartisan. It also barred anyone within Health and Human Services from issuing official communications to anyone that was a public official. So we're talking anyone in Congress or governors, so state legislatures. And again, this also prevented them from clarifying any sort of regulatory questions that people had. And this is difficult because, again, these agencies have to communicate. And this was stopped. It also stopped all public speaking engagements until they had been reviewed and approved by political appointees. Now, this is also a big one. Science happens at conferences. People go to those. There are webinars where you learn about different regulatory things, where they help you understand something that's happening. All of this was nixed with no notice. Hugely disruptive. And I can tell you personally, from communications I was having with people in the FDA at the time, those stopped. They could not communicate with us. And we had critical questions about things happening that would not be answered. Now, there was a carve-out in the policy that stated, oh, if you think something is required by law or it shouldn't be bound by this, talk to the executive secretary and see if we can't get it overturned. But there are so many things that should go out that you can't do that, right? You don't stop the full flow of information just because of something like that. And so they attacked communication right away, which makes it difficult for those regulatory bodies to function in the way they're supposed to. It's like if you had a doctor's appointment, but the doctor was not allowed to tell you anything about test results he had. It's useless to the public that needs it and relies on it. The next thing was the federal funding freeze. So the Office of Management and Budget, essentially the HR for a large portion of the executive branch, issued a memo on January 27th that paused all obligation to disperse federal financial aid and other agency activities until they could be reviewed. The memo was given less than 24 hours. And it was theoretically on pause until February 10th, when reviews were done of all spending. Now, we know that this is wildly unprecedented. Other administrations have never tried anything vaguely similar to this. And we saw the fallout from it damn near immediately. We saw that the Medicare portals were down in all 50 states. We saw that governors were not getting money for their states that they had been allocated by law. We saw all of this. Things that should have been happening were not, and it was happening immediately. There were, in the plain language of the memo, which you can see here, that there were no carve-outs for really much of anything. So it says, oh, that memo shouldn't have been including Medicare or Medicaid, but the memo didn't say that. This was quickly held up in court, but I want to point out that this is blatantly illegal. This is against the text of the Impoundment Act and against the text of the Constitution. Congress is the branch that chooses what we spend money on. And The executive is the one that spends the money according to what was signed into law by Congress. To do anything different is incorrect and should not be done. That freeze was quickly paused by the federal district courts the following day before it could take full effect. But since then, there have been blatant attempts to circumvent that order. Specifically, the White House press secretary issued a proclamation that said the memo was rescinded, but not the freeze. This was a blatant attempt to circumvent the court order, saying, hey, you can't do what that memo says. So they said, what memo? We didn't do a memo. That memo doesn't matter. We're still going to do the thing, but that memo doesn't. So your order doesn't matter. That is trying to defy the court. So we have seen a stifling of communication, and we have seen the first inkling of that stifling of financing. And again, this is a broader one, but we'll focus up a little bit more and see what happens. Interestingly enough, we actually also, on the day that that funding freeze was paused by the courts, see a very targeted attack, not by the administration, but by a conservative watchdog group, the American Accountability Foundation. Yeah, I know, the names, right? Because you know they're not for accountability. They're just slinging mud, like they normally do. So, what the AAF did was issue a target list. Some 57 employees of the Department of Health and Human Services were listed on this target list. On that list, it included their names, their photos, and their work histories. Most of them were called out for being part of healthcare equity. So essentially, that is groups that were people that were charged with making sure that access to healthcare in the country was even, that where we needed it, it was. This was an obvious attempt at intimidation, straight out of the right-wing playbook, for making sure that your enemies feel afraid. Making sure that people have a list of people whose names and occupations and work histories and faces are very easy for you to find should you want to do something. Which is, you guessed it, intimidation. So again, we're going after the workforce. Now, let's talk about the most devastating thing in terms of the financials and the financial attack on science. And this is specifically around a complex topic that I'm going to try to explain. And that is indirect grant costs for the National Institutes of Health. I know it sounds boring, but stick with me. So, indirect costs, which can also be called F&A or facilities and administration costs, which in the private sector would generally be called overhead, are part of grants. So when you ask for a grant, it has two different components. The first is direct costs. So this is the salaries of the employees that are getting paid for by the grant. This is supplies you need specifically for the thing. So for instance, if you were doing a study on lab rats for some sort of chemical exposure, they would pay for the researchers doing the work, the chemicals, the rats, the bedding for those rats, the food for those rats, and every sort of cost associated directly with the project. Those are direct costs. Now, there is another part of the grant called indirect costs, and that's the overhead. So that is paying for the building you're in. That is paying for the electricity, for the internet, for security, for HR, for administrators for the funds, for health and safety people, for the way the funds get managed. And indirect costs are always a percentage of the total grant cost. So you can have an indirect cost of 25%, which means if you had a grant of $100, I know, really low, not a real thing, but if you had a grant of $100 with 25% indirect costs, then you would get 100 for the grant and then 25%, so $25 for indirect costs. Now, what the NIH did on February 7th was to issue a proclamation that all indirect costs would be capped at 15%. So there are a couple of things you should understand about indirect costs to sort of help flesh that out. The first is that the average indirect cost rate for NIH, for what people have been requesting, was 29%, so about 30%. So about double that 15% indirect rate. But here's the kicker. Indirect costs are individually negotiated between the group doing the funding in NIH and the group receiving the funding. So any university might have a different indirect rate than another because they have different costs, because they have different facilities, because they have different things to maintain. And now you could say, oh, well, if they're just changing the rates going forward, people can adjust for that. They didn't. They changed those rates both moving forward and retroactively. So say you had a grant that paid out for the year, for the fiscal year, in 4 installments. And you got your first 2 how you expected, and they make this change. You are now getting less money on the next 2 for something that was already agreed upon. And it's really, really important to note that indirect funding for grants, that indirect cost, props up a large portion of university budgets. Because research, pure research, is not profit-driven. And companies generally won't do it because it won't lead to anything. So all that baseline research, the things that help you develop your functional research on something that you can then sell or make a product from, all of that core work is generally done by universities. And in some states, the largest employers are public universities that receive funding from these indirect funds. Now, you could take issue with how this system works. You could say, hey, maybe we should directly fund universities more so that they don't need to supplement their existence with these indirect costs. And that's a discussion we could have, but that's not the discussion we are having. That is not the option that's been placed before us. It is simply to reduce those indirect costs, which will have a direct negative effect on industries around research. You don't need custodians if you can't afford them. And all that support industry stuff goes away, which is an indirect hit to a bunch of people. Now, what you have to sort of ask yourself about these indirect grant costs is about what is it doing? Well, based on current funding levels, it's about a $4 billion cut, and it would do a great amount of damage to research into diseases, into finding new technologies and creating new technologies, and into understanding health problems that we have. This is a direct hit to not just researchers, but to something that is very vital to America, which is our innovation in science. We sit so high on a pedestal because of that. The best scientists in the world come here to do science because we innovate. But when you cut off funding like this, you lose that. And I know that we have a bunch of scientists who are seeing what is happening, seeing the attacks on our institutions, and are looking to jump ship, to go somewhere else because this is a dangerous environment for them. Now, here's the thing. Why would we be cutting NIH funding? It's important to note that adjusted for inflation, grant funding by the NIH has been flat for the last 20 years. So in 2005, NIH funding was about $20 billion. In 2024, it was about $32 billion. When you adjust for inflation, that's the same number. So the number has been going up, but it is flat for inflation. And you see a lot of inflation in scientific supplies and equipment, and all of that ends up hurting us. So this is a direct assault on the funding we need to do science. So we're attacking communication by stopping what the NIH and other health agencies in the Health and Human Services can say to the public, to legislators, and to the states. We're attacking the funding both indirectly through the general freeze and directly through the NIH indirect grant rate reduction and standardization. Now, one important thing to note is that the justification given for that indirect rate cut, they'll say, oh, X number of institutions said they would be willing to accept 0% in indirect costs. That was from a study specifically done around private institutions, which generally pay much lower rates of indirect costs than the government. Because, one, the government benefits from the research it funds. In terms of innovation, in terms of job creation, it benefits from it. Private foundations do not. Additionally, the reason that universities and other institutions are willing to accept a lower rate from private foundations is because they receive that funding already from the government. So, it's false equivalency led to trick you to believe that they are being greedy when they are just trying to survive. Now, one other thing we should talk about is around the language used in grants. So there have been increasing guidance and concern issued around language used in grants. And there are a bunch of extremely common science words that will get new grant proposals flagged for being woke or DEI. Those words include common science terms such as barrier, biased, discrimination, female, excluded, inclusive, status, systemic, and women. All standard words. If you can tell me how you could discuss a study about something in the female reproductive system without using the word female, tricky. But then you also have things like bias, where you're saying, oh, this thing is biased towards doing this, or there is a barrier between these two things, or this is an inclusive model, or that is excluded. All of these things which are innocuous, but get roped in with woke or DEI. And I want to be real fucking clear. My best essay when I was applying to PhD programs was about how science was not about the answers you give, but about the questions you ask. That being able to ask different questions makes you a better scientist and leads you to new innovations and to new ways that things are done. Now, what diversity is about in the diversity, equity, and inclusion is about making sure that you get a bunch of people with a bunch of different viewpoints, with a bunch of different experiences, who can look at something and ask a better question. If everybody has the exact same upbringing as you, they'll ask the same question, and it's redundant and useless. The equity is about making sure that you help people who need more help because of the situation they were in. You make sure that you're put on the same footing so that you're not starting at third base while they're starting at first, while someone else is starting at home plate. That's it. That's what equity is. And then inclusion is making sure that people feel like they belong in a place. I think we've all gone into a spot, into a bar or a club or just into a room where we felt like we didn't belong. And you know what happens? You leave. And so you might lose the best person who could do a thing. That's DEI. And it is important in science, just like it is anywhere else. So when I go through this next set of things and I talk about DEI, I want to be really clear. There is nothing wrong with it. As a matter of fact, it is a good thing. And it's not about taking something away from someone. It's about making sure we're all starting at the same spot. And that's what America is about. It is a land of opportunity, and we should be providing that opportunity to everyone. That's it. And anyone who says different, anyone who says DEI out of the side of their mouth is just using it for whatever slur they're too afraid to say. So, I want to specifically talk about a Senate report on woke DEI grants. This was done by everyone's least favorite senator, Ted Cruz. I believe it was Lindsey Graham who said you could shoot Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and have the trial in the Senate and no one would vote to convict? That guy. He used his position as chair of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee to release a database of woke DEI grants that were issued by the NSF. So it categorizes these grants based on the use of trigger words to link them to things that he finds objectionable, such as DEI, race, gender, environmental justice, or social status. Now, these trigger words are flatly ridiculous, and the staffers who put the report together didn't do their due diligence to read everything. So let's talk about that a little bit in depth. This report identifies 3,483 grants that it calls DEI, totaling roughly $2.06 billion, which is out of an NIH grant funding budget of approximately $7 billion. Now, I'm good at what I do. But to be clear, in the amount of time between when this database sort of hit back into popularity on February 11th and when I'm filming this now on February 14th, I did not have time to go through 3,500 grants, read the proposal part, to be able to tell you what full percentage they're just pants-shittingly wrong about. So I did this two ways. First, I looked at a subject where I am well-versed, biology, and can tell you from the 24 I looked at, none of them warranted this classification as DEI or woke. They were standard biological studies, things that no one should bat an eye at. Talking about, for instance, one in particular was about the effect of adipose on hormones in pregnant women. And that got flagged for gender because it said woman. That's a theme. So what I did do, because unlike apparently the Senate staffers of one Ted Cruz, I actually have, scruples, the ability to do any sort of work. I went through the first 100 grants, the top 100 grants in terms of value, in terms of cost. And what I found was that these top 100 grants accounted for approximately $565 million of that $2 billion in funding, which is about 27.5% of the total funding for that $2 billion. And of those, 19 were specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that totaled somewhere in the neighborhood of about $76 million of funding. 13.5% of that top 100 grants by value. Most of the other grants contained those flagged terms, and in doing so, usually out of context, usually not at all related. Now, it is important to point out that by federal law, there are a bunch of criteria, which we're going to list right up here, about how you sort of value grants and you can show that they are important. One of those tenets that you can do is to say how it helps underserved communities. So that can be any group that usually does not have access to something. So a couple of these grants are about funding data centers in parts of the country like Kentucky that traditionally don't have these. And that is how it helps an underserved community. And that's it. That's it. It helps a group that normally does not have something that shows up. Or it might allow a group to be helped. And that is your woke DEI stuff. I will also note, really harping on anything related to the environment, whether or not you mention climate change. There was one that was specifically about the interface between different types of environmental phenomena and wildfires. So really just something to help us understand these adverse weather effects and how we can sort of deal with those as we move forward. Now, you can find the entire report at a link listed in the description, and you can scroll through if you want. But again, most of it is just fear-mongering bullshit. And I want to be clear. The people who made this report knew what they were doing. Because it takes about a third grade reading level to read through those and understand that the person who called them woke or DEI is full of shit. And these were congressional staffers, so you know they've got a pretty decent reading level. But the problem becomes, you put out this report, which, look at the report. Whoever made it can't fucking design for shit, but that's neither here nor there. Look at this report and understand that it is fear-mongering. But it works because it is so easy to just say, it's woke and it's DEI. And then I have to sit here and spend an hour going through 100 grant synopses and say, oh no, they're full of shit. Right? And that's something we have to address in terms of our messaging. But it depends on who we're talking to. So you can take this approach where you point out specific things. That one, or that one, or that one. And say, see, there's nothing wrong with this. They lied to you, and they will continue to lie to you. And you would use that for people who aren't already in the tank for one point of view or the other. But if it's someone on the right who's just going to lie to you, like Ted Cruz and his staffers, then you just say, hey, you're full of shit, and you move on. Maybe pick out one stupid thing he said. Like that time he read Dr. Seuss on the floor of the Senate because he's a fucking asshole. There is one last bit of sort of communication that has been rolled back. A lot of scientific data, a bunch of it, just mountains, was after the inauguration being systematically removed from public websites by the administration. I want to be clear about data gathered by the government, especially health data. We have paid for that. That is ours. They took it down because they did not like truth, and they were forced by a court to return it. But we have to watch out because this is their move going forward. Now, we see that they attack the funding with the cap on grants, with trying to stop anything that uses any of these woke trigger words. I know, snowflakes, right? So they stop the funding for things they don't like. Or just in general, because they don't like science. They stop communication. They'll take data and they'll stop public agencies from talking to the public. And then personnel. And this is the fucked up one. Not that they're all not fucked up, but this one in particular. What they're doing is they are reducing force, a reduction in force, or an RIF, where they're just slashing large swaths of federal employees. Just today, they've begun to let go all probationary employees, so people who worked for less than a year. That is estimated to be about 1/10 of the NIH's staff. Gone. And it's not just that they were public servants who gave up more lucrative pay in the private sector to do something they believed in for this country and for us, but these are people who now don't have jobs because some rich asshole who is so fucking hungry and weak that being the richest man on earth is not enough for him, that he wants to be loved every second. Some vindictive rich asshole decided that those people were worth less than what he thought they should be, that they were worthless and that they shouldn't have employment. These attacks are not just on funding because we're in a bad spot. No, they're attacks on fundamental parts of a system that works constantly behind the scenes, that is going to have trouble doing that moving forward. These are attacks on American exceptionalism, on the things that we do well. And I get it's, of course, you could always use more efficiency. But those decisions should be made by people who understand the circumstances and the thing they're talking about, not by rich assholes who bought their way into a position of power that they could have never gotten based on their ideas or merit or their likability, but who did it solely with money to say other people need to cut back. There is a real fucking problem in this country and in this world with people thinking that money equals virtue, or that money equals skill, or that money equals being better than someone else. Every billionaire is a failure of a system that allowed them to accumulate more wealth than anyone can really accurately comprehend. And that's a failure we've lived with for too long. But now we've added another layer on top, where we're letting these people be in charge because we think that means they're better. Their money must mean they're better. But they're not. To be a billionaire is to be callous and uncaring, and to let them run the government is folly. I feel like we can do better. But it's tough. And I get that. And I understand that everything can feel hopeless right now. But I will tell you, even in all that hopelessness that I have been feeling as of late, and I'm sure you have too, digging into something like this video today, with the timeline, with the sources, with the specific examples, and specifically calling out where people are lying to you, has made me feel less hopeless. It's made me feel like I can do something. And I think that's it. I think that's it for us. I think that's what we do. I can't do this for everything, but I can do this for science, because it's what I do. And it's what we need in regards to that. But I can't do that for the Treasury, and I can't do that for law enforcement, and I can't do that for the Department of Justice, and I can't do that for so many different parts of the government that are currently under siege. But I can do that for Health and Human Services. And my focus there means you don't have to. I will tell you what is happening. So you should be that focus for someone else. Find the part that you understand, and that's the thing you dig into. Not everybody can focus on everything, but we can all focus on one thing. And that's the way we start to hold them accountable. And that's the way we start to warn people about what will happen and to push back on the worst excesses of what we're seeing. But at the end of the day, take care of yourself. Stay safe. And I'll see you next week.